terminology. You might hear something called prose or prose fiction, and prose is just written or spoken language in its ordinary form, without any kind of metrical structure, meaning, like an intended rhythm or beat like you would find in poetry. And prose is used in fiction and nonfiction. So the novel that we read, that's written in prose. The articles that you read about the authors or about these novels or films, also written in prose, right? It's the common language. The only difference in prose is really with time and place. So prose written today in 2020 is going to look very familiar to you, right? And probably not be all that difficult for you to read and understand for the most part. But prose written in, the 1800s, like when we get to our final novel of the semester, Jane Eyre, that may look a little bit different from you, and a lot of the words and the sentence structure will be familiar, but many of the words might not be, and the language may seem more difficult. And really, the only real reason for that is because it was written in a different place in a different time, right? So, prose is just the language of a period, of an era, of a time. Fiction is literature in the form of prose, right? Especially short stories and novels that describes imaginary events and people. In other words, when we talk about fiction, we're talking about made up events, right? Things that are not real that happen to be in the written form. So everything that we're reading as far as the novels this semester are fictional. We contrast that with nonfiction, and that's prose writing that's based on facts, real events, real people, biography, history. And so the articles that we read to help us understand the texts from week to week, that's nonfiction. That's researched material, right? Based in evidence, based in fact, to help us understand the fiction that we're reading. Narrative, you'll hear me say a lot. You might hear me write a lot or see me write a lot in like the discussion threads, for example, and that's a spoken or written account of connected events, like a plot. Or in other words, it's a story that's told by a narrator, right? Um, so, just like all of the fiction that we're reading this semester is in the form of the novel, each of these novels is a narrative because they're told through the eyes, through the mouth, through the lens of a particular narrator who may or may not be a participant or a character in the story. We'll have to figure that out as we go. So one thing you want to pay attention to is we know that we're reading novels. We know that all of these novels are fiction, okay? But one of the first tasks we're going to have to charge ourselves with is what kind of narrator do we have in each of these novels? Because they may be different and might be first person, and that's a narrator that uses the I voice and that participates in the story, right? I was walking down the street and a bucket fell on my head and I got really angry. There's a first person narrator who's also a character in the story. It could be third person, right? And that's a narrator who's watching the events unfold and telling us all about it. So she was walking down the street and she turned the corner and a bucket fell on her head and she got really angry. That's a third person narrator. Maybe a participant in the story, it might be a character, right? Or might not be. It might just be some entity that's helping us see and understand what's going on. And there are different kinds of third person narrators. The two most common are the limited, right? A third person narrator that's very closely attached to one character in the novel, and we can't really get any other perspectives besides that one character. Or an omniscient narrator, right? And that's a narrator who knows everything, sees everything, can jump around from character to character, can move in time and space within the story, right? You'll see that a lot in fantasy novels, for example, where the narrator might bounce from one realm of a kingdom to another realm or go back and forwards in time. So, what we're looking for is the narrator a first person participant using the I voice? Are they a third person, somebody who's watching the story unfold and relating it to us as they see it? And then, if it's a third person, do they have all of the information possible and they basically have unlimited knowledge? Then we know it's a third person omniscient. Or are they limited to one particular character and they sort of follow that one character around and they're never allowed access to anybody else in the story's thoughts, no other character's feelings? Then we've got that third person limited. And then some of the forms are novel and novella, short story, flash or microfiction, the essay, creative nonfiction, for example. What we're most concerned with for this particular literature class is the novel, which is a narrative of a certain length that's divided into chapters. And each of the chapters might deal with different components of that plot. But it's all one linked story, right? Usually in progressive order. So, chronological order, for example. This happens, and then this, and then this, and then this. The other one that we may be interested in um, is the essay, because we will be reading some essays, some articles every week to help us understand these novels and get more information, or to understand film, or to understand the adaptation process between novels and films. So in addition to the basics, we're going to go into some three of the most important terms or concepts in literary studies. And the first thing that we need to know is plot, right? So like a fable, let's say the Grimm brothers' tale, uh, thinking about Hansel and Gretel, for example, or those other the original fables. Um, these early stories, right? These legends, these mythologies are essentially where plot begins in our history. And the reason that we have things like novels now is because of this tradition of storytelling that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation since the very beginning. And late in the semester, we're going to go through together sort of a brief history of narrative, and we'll talk about the origins of storytelling and how we got to where we are today. But one thing to think about is plot. This idea of a structured story has been around for a long time. And plot sometimes refers simply to the events in a story, right? But plot also means the artistic arrangement of those events. So, from the opening sentence of a story of the Brothers Grimm, for example, like Godfather Death, we watch the unfolding of a dramatic situation. And that's where a person is involved in some kind of conflict. In We've Always Lived in the Castle, for example, the persons involved are two sisters, right? And those two sisters are in conflict with the neighborhood and the people of that neighborhood in which they live. Nobody likes each other. And so their conflict is kind of man versus man, man versus society, elements of those. Drama in fiction occurs in any of those clashes, right? Those clash of wills, clash of desires, clash of powers, whether it's a conflict of character against character, character against society, character against some natural force, right? Or even character against a supernatural entity. So, like any shapely tale, we've always lived in the castle, the novel that we're about to start. It has its beginning, and it has a middle, and it has an end. And in fact, it's unusual to find a story that's so clearly displaying the elements of structure, right, as those that are found in works of classic fiction. So, in our example, we might look to exposition first, okay? And exposition is like an introduction that explains what's happening or what's about to happen or what has already happened, right? And so the exposition at the start of We Have Always in the Castle tells us a little bit about what happened before the story opened, right? And provides some background information that we need in order to understand and care about what's going to happen next. So as you begin to read We've Always Lived in the Castle, you want to pay very close attention, not just to who is telling the story, right? Who is this narrator, but what information is being given right away at the very in the opening paragraph even of this novel. I will say that this opening paragraph, Shirley Jackson is famous for her openings, and like her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, this one that we're reading, We've Always Lived in the Castle, packs a lot of critical, important information about the entire novel right away in the first paragraph of the novel. So the exposition can be very brief, right? But exposition is really a narrator explaining, giving, providing information before the action of the novel sets in and characters start talking to each other and moving around and things like that. After the exposition and sort of the opening of a plot, we get to usually a conflict or a complication, right? And that's where the story starts to pick up, because once you've got conflict or complications for the characters to start figuring out, that's where all of the other story elements start to unfold, and we learn about character relationships, we learn about character motivations, we learn about protagonists and antagonists, for example. And so what about those terms, protagonist versus antagonist? Well, the protagonist is sometimes called the hero, right? But it might just also refer to the main character, right? Who's not necessarily brave or virtuous or heroic in the traditional sense. So we will have to decide who is the protagonist of We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and then we might determine, are they a hero? Are they an anti-hero? Are they simply a main character? What kind of protagonist do we have? But the basic term is always protagonist when we're referring to a main character. Now, what kind of protagonist are they? That's up for grabs, right? Every novel's protagonist is going to be a little bit different, and we may fall in love with some protagonists, right? They might be awesome characters who are, really cool or really funny or really virtuous, and we can get on their side and root for them. Other protagonists we might not like very much, right? They might do some things that we disagree with. They may make us uncomfortable or confused. So we'll work through that. The antagonist is the opposite of that, right? So the antagonist is whoever stands in the way of the protagonist, whoever is set up as sort of the opposite of the main character. This may be in traditional storytelling, we'd think of it as the villain, right? But it can get more subtle, more complicated than just hero versus villain. It might be a complicated, complex, not so virtuous protagonist versus the society in which she lives, right? And how that society acts towards her or stifles her or whatever the case may be. So we've got protagonists versus antagonists. The other terms to know about plot are crisis and climax. So tension builds with complications, and we go from complication to complication, or from conflict to conflict. The big events, right? The major conflicts are often what we call crises, right? So if a character experiences a crisis, we know we're usually about in the middle or just over the middle point of the plot, because the crisis is what really challenges the main character, the protagonist. Sometimes the protagonist and the narrator are the same person, in which case this is the moment when they have to figure something out, and it's going to change everything else and the rest of the story, right? Oftentimes it's making a decision about something important, right? Some action that they have to take. And dealing with that crisis, the events, the fallout, everything that happens after the crisis is what leads us towards the climax. And the climax is like the big end scene. Right before the novel ends, we will get some final showdown, right? Between the character and herself, between the character and her antagonist, between the character and God or a supernatural force, whatever they're dealing with that has been holding them back or complicating their lives. Okay, so typical plot progression is we've got a protagonist who's dealing with complications, right? Dealing with conflicts, and they deal with it and they get over it, deal with it and they get over it. As the plot moves forward, it builds towards a major crisis that the character must face, and they must get through it in some ways. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. The results of that crisis bring us to the climax, right? That ending, and everything there leads us toward the final pages and sort of that the end. Some other things we may want to know are just a couple of narrative techniques. So plot has beginning, middle, and end, and those parts are made up of some kind of dramatic situation, conflicts, a crisis, and a climax. Um, but the treatment of plot is just one aspect of an author's artistry. Different arrangements of that same material are possible, right? A writer might decide to tell of the events in chronological order, beginning with whatever happened first and then next and then next. Or she might open the story with the last event and tell everything that led up to it. So we might have a novel where we start in present time and they tell us what just happened, right? And then move us backwards through time or forwards through time in that way, like one big long flashback. Sometimes the writer chooses to skip, rapidly over the exposition, doesn't give us any of that background information, and they just begin in medias res, which is what's the Latin for in the midst of things, right? So that's where we open a book and we find the action has already started and the character's already involved in something, and we've got no context yet. It can be a little bit jarring, but science fiction and action novels, for example, detective stories sometimes start that way. And that method's not a modern invention, although it is becoming more and more common for some reason. But you may have heard of a writer named Homer who wrote a story called The Odyssey. And Homer, begins the Odyssey with his hero, Odysseus. Uh, he's mysteriously late, right, getting home from the war, and his son is searching for him. So Odysseus is already in his journey when we open the first page of the Odyssey. Same thing with John Milton's Paradise Lost. That opens with Satan already defeated in his revolt against God, right? And so we're already in the midst of things when these stories begin. One thing to look at as we start each of our novels is, are we beginning with exposition? Are we getting background information? Are we beginning in medias res, right? In the midst of things? Things have already happened. Or maybe we're in a flashback or being treated to some kind of foreshadowing. Most novels will not begin with flashback or foreshadowing, although it does happen, right? But you will find elements throughout the course of a plot within a novel of flashback, where the author, or the narrator, I should say, brings us back in time to some important event or moment that helps shape the character or that helps get the character into the situation that they're facing. Foreshadowing is a little bit more subtle. It doesn't necessarily bring us forward in time the way that flashback actually brings us backward in time in the story. But foreshadowing will make an allusion to something that's going to happen, right? It's like little clues being dropped about information we haven't yet received, but we can get a sense that it's coming. So, to analyze plot, you want to remember that plotting isn't superficial, okay? Yes, a novel has to have a beginning and a middle and an end, but the author has decided how they're going to get their narrator to deliver that information to us. So everything's been done on purpose, and we need to keep that in mind. Also remember that small events can have really large consequences. You may have heard the term the butterfly effect, right? Whereas there's this idea that if you had the opportunity to go back in time, you want to be very careful not to change anything, right? Don't even slap a bug that lands on your arm, because you never know what's going to happen, what changes could be caused. So we want to look at not just the big events in these novels, these major things that happen that are super obvious, like one character punches another character in the face. Okay, that's going to have some impact, right? Some effect. But what are the little things that might go unnoticed if we're not paying close attention? Remember also that action reveals character, okay? So actions that the characters take are intentional, and they also tell us what kind of character that we're dealing with. Are they benevolent? Are they kind? Are they thoughtful? Or are they selfish? Are they cruel, right? Are they ambitious? And you might think about this in the way that we think about drama, like going to see a play. What does the actor do that reveals to us the way that they feel or the way that they think? Do they have a smirk on their face, right, telling us that they're being sarcastic when they say something? Look for those little clues in a character's action to see what else we can learn about that character besides just the things that they say. And then plot is also about cause and effect, right? So one thing will cause something else to happen, and that effect might cause something else. So I've got here in the corner sort of a visual image of a plot. We start with exposition or stasis, right? A description of what's happening, background information, context, and then we get the rising on action with those little mini conflicts that lead us up to the big climax, that moment where the character has got to face something, and everything after that point will change. And then we get the falling action where we see what the results of that character's decision or action is, and finally our resolution, right? The end of the novel. Where does everything end up? Another thing that we need to familiarize ourselves with is point of view. All right, so narrators come in many forms. And because stories usually are told by someone, almost every story has some kind of narrator. And some theorists reserve the term narrator for a character who tells a story in the first person. But that's not really accurate, right? We should use it in a wider sense to mean a recording consciousness that an author creates who may or may not be a participant in the events of the story. They may or may not be a character in the story itself. Real persons can tell a story in a factual way, right? But when those events are written in a story, that's fiction, right? When they're made up, when they're untrue, when they're fantasy, when they're imagined, we've got fiction. Something like a memoir, a travelogue, or an autobiography, if I'm writing a memoir of my travels to Japan, right, or a travel log of those events, that's nonfiction. Those are real events that happen, so I'm not a narrator anymore. To identify a story's point of view, you want to describe the role the narrator plays in the events, and then any limits that are placed on his or her knowledge of those events. In a novel, it's usual for the writer to maintain one point of view from beginning to end, but there's nothing to stop the narrator from introducing other points of view as well. And in fact, that's becoming really popular in young adult fiction right now, where you might get 3 different characters narrating their own version of the same story. So we have some types of narrators here. I went over them briefly earlier in first and third person, but first person is also sometimes called the participant narrator, and that's when a narrator is a participant in the events of the story. They are a dramatized character who writes in the first person. So you might think of like a protagonist like Huckleberry Finn in the novel Huckleberry Finn, right? He's a participant narrator. There's also the non-participant narrator, okay? And that's one who remains outside of the action of the story. They're just viewing the characters, perhaps seeing into the minds of one character or maybe a few of them, depending on how limited this narrator is. But they're going to refer to characters as he, she, they, right? Never I. There's also the all-knowing or omniscient narrator that I mentioned earlier, and that's a narrator who can jump into the mind of any character in the story. They can move around from place to place. They can add commentary or opinion about what's happening in the novel. A character might say something, and the omniscient narrator could interject and say something like, clearly this was a lie, right? And so we get extra what's called editorial information. We might also get impartial consciousness. And that's where a narrator presents the thoughts and actions of the characters but doesn't judge them or comment on them. And in that case, we might say we have a more reliable narrator than one who interjects their opinion all the time. There's also the limited omniscient narrator, right? So when a non-participating narrator sees the events through the eyes of one single character, whether that's a major character or a minor one doesn't really matter, but they're stuck to one character, and so the point of view is limited or selective. The author selects which character's perspective to see from, right? The omniscience is his and not the narrator's. And in this case, the narrator is almost entirely confined to knowing just the thoughts and perceptions and feelings of that one character for the entire length of the novel, as opposed to being able to jump around and give the reader all sorts of different perspectives. We have objective point of view, and in the objective point of view, the narrator doesn't enter the mind of any character, but instead describes those events from the outside, and they stay impersonal. They do not react in judgment. So they might tell us what people say. They might explain or describe how a character's face looks, or if he or she leaves us to infer their thoughts and feelings, right? So we may see that a character wrinkled their forehead in concentration, but we won't get the narrator interjecting to say, wrinkled their forehead, it was clear that they were angry and confused, right? The narrator doesn't provide that information for us. We just have to infer that based on what the narrator does tell us about the character, about their facial expressions, for example, or body language. Some people call this the fly on the wall narrator, right? It's like we have an observer in the story to tell us what's going on, and then we have to figure out everything else from there. There's also sometimes an unreliable narrator, and in a story told by an unreliable narrator, the point of view is from a person who we perceive as the reader is being maybe deceptive, maybe self-deceptive or deluded, maybe a little deranged, right? Not seeing everything very clearly, or perhaps they're overly dramatic, or whatever the case may be. Although this narrative device has been employed for a very long time by great authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Eudora Welty, right? Most contemporary writers have been particularly fond of unreliable narrators for some reason. And there's something to discuss, I think, for us this semester about if we find unreliable narrators in our novels this semester, why did the author choose to make them that way, right? Why would they have us doubt the information that the narrator is giving to us? And then there's some other points, types of narrators that are pretty uncommon. One is the second person, and that's where a narrator is articulating the story from the you perspective, which is very unsettling. So it would go something like, oh, you walk into a dark room, you search for the light switch, but you can't find it. Suddenly you hear a strange noise, right? That's pretty unusual, and it's pretty uncommon because it is a little bit jarring. And as a general rule of thumb in writing, authors and narrators don't want to address their audiences so directly like that because it makes people uncomfortable. So the one place you might find a second person narrator is in horror stories, for example, or mystery stories, where it's over the top intentional. Maybe think back to being a kid if you ever read those choose your own adventure books where the point was to make the reader be a part of the story. Then sure, you would get it. But typically first person or third person is what we see from our narrators. There may also be naive narrators or innocent narrators, and so those are for example, child narrators that maybe don't understand the adult world that they're dealing with. And sometimes you might even see a non-human narrator. If you think about a book like Watership Down, for example, you've got an entire story that's being narrated by animals. And the last thing to remember or to know about is stream of consciousness narration, and that's a phrase that was coined by William James that essentially it describes this procession of thoughts passing through the mind, and the story is told almost automatically without any stops or breaks or revisions, right? And so stream of consciousness is a kind of narration where everything just falls out, and whatever falls out is the story. Some writers that you may be familiar with or have heard of include Jack Kerouac. He was really famous for doing his his novel On the Road, one of the most famous American novels of all time, as kind of a stream of consciousness experience where he wrote it all on, essentially rolls of toilet paper as the ideas came to him while he was traveling, and just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote until the story was done, and didn't go back and do a whole lot of shifting of information or editing or revising. And then, in addition to knowing about point of view, we want to think about how to analyze it. So you want to consider who's telling the story first of all, and how does a first person limited point of view different from a third person omniscient? As we progress through the story, start to compare and contrast these narrators. You might come up with an interesting idea for the the midterm essay, for example. What implications do these choices of narrator have on reliability or authority, right? How trustworthy they are. You also want to ask why the narrator is telling the story. Do they have any bias? Are they being objective? Or are they clearly biased towards one perspective, right? So it's not just enough to sit back and enjoy the story. We want to know, why is this narrator telling us the things that they are telling us? What do they want from the reader? And then you want to think about whether anything important is being left out. Sometimes we can learn as much about a character or a narrator or a story by what's not there, what's not being told to us, as we can from the actual information that we do get. So think about what's missing, what information is held back. And oftentimes we'll know that a narrator is biased or unreliable when they don't reveal things to us that we should probably know if we're going to understand the story truly. Last concept to talk about today is character, and so I'll go through some of the different ones here very briefly. First, there are what's known as stock characters. And they're known for their outstanding traits, like the bragging soldier, the Prince Charming of fairy tales, the mad scientist, right, from horror movies. So stock characters have their purposes, but in most novels, especially novels written more contemporarily, that is not common anymore. Some things that we do want to look for, which will happen in almost any novel, narrative, or piece of fiction that we read, are flat characters versus round characters. And a flat character is a character that is there to serve a role, but they don't have a lot of complexity, right? We may never learn very much about them. So early on in We Have Always Lived in the Castle, for example, there are some characters that come for a visit, and we might compare them to the sisters, who are the main characters in the story. The sisters are going to be round characters because we get a lot of information about them. We spend a lot of time with them. We learn different things about them. The visitors, we don't get much from them. They come to serve their purpose, but really they come as sort of a foil to help us understand the main characters better. So in that way, they're flat characters, right? They're just not very well developed. There's also static versus dynamic characters. And a static character is one that will not change over the course of the novel, right? It may be a character who's very dopey and confused and unreliable at the beginning of the novel, and hey, guess what? You finished the book and they were dopey and confused and unreliable the whole time. A dynamic character is one that changes. They go through a life cycle the way that a real human being would. They grow, they change, they make mistakes, they have successes, they fall down and they get back up again, and they learn things about themselves. And those tend to be, of course, the main characters, sometimes the narrators themselves. So you see, if you know Harry Potter, I've got Mr. Severus Snape up there. And if we looked at the character like Severus Snape over the course of the 7 books of the Harry Potter series, we would early on, right, think that he might be kind of a flat, static character. If we're reading the first couple of books, he just seems like one of the antagonists, right? As the story progresses, though, he becomes more and more important, and you learn more and more about him, and you get some backstory, and